Uh, it's it's a very complicated question, the informal work and informal workers. Informal workers are workers who work in different kinds of work, different nature of work that they do without having any specific documentation. They do it mainly as a survival mechanism. They want to survive somehow, they don't have any particular work, therefore they do any kind of job that will help them continue with their regular lives. So informal workers are workers who would work on any job without having proper documentation, without getting benefits from labor laws, without getting social security protections. So these are informal workers. And informal work, it's again a very wide connotation. Informal work would mean different kinds of work. For example, street vendors, people who mainly in developing countries, people who sit by the side of the street and sell stuff, sell vegetables, sell toys, and all the things that they're selling by the side of the street, they're street vendors and they're informal workers. People who work at some other people's home, domestic workers, they are also informal workers in the sense that these workers are not documented. There is an employment relationship between the homeowner and the worker who is working in the home, cooking and washing and doing dishes, but they're not documented. They don't get protection from labor laws. They are also informal worker. Interestingly, some of the multinational corporations subcontract some of their work, especially in the garment sector or in shoe production sector. There are big names in some of these sectors who outsource their work, subcontract their work in some of the developing countries such as Bangladesh, India, China, Thailand. And workers sit over there to make some of these clothes and shoes and then send it over again to these corporations. So they are home-based workers. And sometimes what happens, the contractor who appoints them, the contractor do not register these workers. So these workers remain undocumented, and therefore, because they're undocumented, they don't get any benefits from either the state or the employer or the principal employer who is actually employing them. That's the multinational corporations. So what I'm trying to suggest is informal work and informal workers are very heterogeneous in nature. They can be very diverse. There are circumstances where informal work could be done in a formal undertaking. For example, there is a big office, a multinational corporation or any other public office, public sector office like a government office. There what happens sometimes, peon who takes your letters from here to there and other different categories of staff such as cleaners and maintenance people, sometimes they're employed without appropriate documentation. So what happens is, even though it's a public sector undertaking or a big corporation or a company, what happens is these workers who are taken, for example, on temporary basis, they're not given any benefits that are available to other workers in that particular firm. So there can be instances where informal workers could work in formal undertaking. So it's a very diverse field as to who are informal workers and what is informal work. Informality is associated with different terminologies. We use different terms to signify informal work and informal worker. The three most important terms are informal employment, informal sector, and informal economy. So when the term came into existence in 1972-1973, we termed it as informal sector to mean units, informal units. So what I mean by informal units are very small scale units, when small vendors or people having small establishments, creating goods, delivering services. So they are sectors, they are small establishments, but the problem with them are they are not registered as per the law of a particular country. So they are not registered under the company's law, they are not registered under a partnership firm, they are not registered under any law that mandates registration of an establishment or of an unit. So what happens, they become excluded from a monitoring mechanism. So government cannot monitor how many units are there. So they were called informal sector. But as I have mentioned earlier, it's not always necessary that informal workers would work only in informal sector. There could be informal workers who are also working in the formal sector, like a formal farm, but a few number of informal workers are employed there without documentation, without proper minimum wages, without following other different laws. So they are also informal workers, but they are not in the informal sector. Therefore, we need to distinguish between sector and employment, informal employment. Finally, informal economy is a very wide term that includes both informal sector as well as informal workers or informal employment. Therefore, the International Labour Organization has shifted from their definition of informal sector then to informal employment, and informal economy suggests both of it. So the way informal employment is defined is workers who are working in the informal sector. Second, workers who are working in the formal sector but working informally. And third category are self-employed workers. Now self-employed workers do not have any employer. Therefore, there is no employment relationship for self-employment workers. Therefore, there is no possibility that self-employed workers could come under the category of informal sector. But they are still in some kind of productive employment. For example, waste pickers, or in some places they are called rat pickers. What they do is they collect solid waste. So different kinds of solid waste are being collected by these workers, such as plastic, bottles, metals. So they collect these solid waste in order to recycle. The recycling is done by the formal sector or firms registered. For example, there could also be firms unregistered who recycle these products. But the workers, people who are collecting these solid waste in order to send to the recycling industry, they are not employed by anyone. So they are self-employed workers. Therefore, if we use the definition of informal sector, we are excluding these categories of self-employed workers as well. Accordingly, the ILO came up with the definition of self-employment or informal employment, which covers self-employment, informal sector workers, and informal workers who are working in the formal establishment. Measurement of informal workers or informal sector is a very difficult task. That is because workers are not registered. These different kinds of work is not registered. The sector is not registered or monitored. Therefore, there is always a difficulty how you measure it. The ILO created a group called the expert group, the Delhi group. They came up with different definitions and different ways to statistically measure informal work and informal employment. And they have devised very sophisticated statistical mechanism by which one can derive what is the nature and extent of informal employment and informal workers around the globe. To give you an example, informal workers are the majority of workers around the globe. And it's surprising that it's only from 1970 we start talking about informal workers. For example, in countries like India, 92% of workers work in the informal sector, or they are informal workers. I would like to correct that. 92% of the workers are informal workers. So these workers, some of them work in the informal sector, some of these informal workers work in the formal sector, and some of the informal workers are informal self-employment. So all of them constitute 92%, including agriculture. Agriculture is really big in countries like India. So what happens is, most of these workers do not get any legislative benefit or social security protection. So they are excluded from the formal security protection or any kind of benefits from the state. What happens under these circumstances? This enormous number of workers gets totally excluded from any kind of benefits. It was in India, and if we think about sub-Saharan Africa, if we think about Asia, if we think about Latin America, informal workers are really predominant in some of these in these continents. Even though I'm emphasizing on developing countries and developing and underdeveloped regions, informal workers are also predominant in developed parts of the world. For example, in a study, it has been found that in 15 European countries, 30% of workers are atypical workers. They don't call them informal workers, but they're atypical workers, which means that sometimes they do different temporary jobs. In 15, say, European countries, they have different employers. They work for one employer in the morning, work for another employer in the evening, and for another employer at night. Then there are migrant workers who come from one country to another country, and they become undocumented migrants, and therefore they work in restaurants and in other small establishments without having the status of worker, and they are paid less than minimum wages. They're not given any kind of guarantees, no benefits are accrued to them. So this is also important in the European context because it's 30% in 15 European countries. And in North America, in the United States, it is about 25% of the total number of workers who are atypical workers or informal workers. And many of them you can actually see in different restaurants, workers, especially illegal immigrants and other kind of migrants migrating from Latin America and Asia and working in small establishments and restaurants in the United States. So it's not only a phenomenon in developing countries, even though in developing countries the number is enormous, it's also increasingly becoming a phenomenon in developed countries, Western countries, which were known for their well-structured labor protection mechanism, but that is disappearing fast because of the number of informal workers who are working in these different establishments. Informal workers are sometimes protected under labor law. They're supposed to be protected. Now I'm talking about laws in book, like law that is there but not perhaps implemented. Again, for example, the country that I'm most familiar with, the legal system that I'm most familiar with, the Indian legal system has a law called the Contract Labor Act, 1970. And then they have laws on construction workers. They have laws on BD workers. BD is kind of a homemade cigarette. Workers working in their homes and making these homemade cigarettes. So there are these laws. But the problem is when a contractor is employing workers, he is not documenting them. He or she is not maintaining a master roll. They're not maintaining accounts of the establishment. Therefore, what's happening is these workers are getting excluded from any labor law protection. So there are some laws which could be applied to informal workers, but the workers cannot avail the benefit of these laws because they are excluded from documentation and any kind of monitoring. However, for a good number of informal workers, there are no laws. Again, for example, for domestic workers, people who are working in somebody else's house, or for rat pickers or waste pickers, there is no law that talks about their security, talks about benefits such as maternity benefit, pension, provident fund, or unemployment insurance or death benefit. There are no such laws that could protect these workers because laws are based principally on an employment relationship. So labor law is based on employment relationship, which means labor law is applicable to workers who has an employer and the benefits from the employer goes to workers. But in the case of informal workers, the majority of informal workers are self-employed. They do not have an employer. And because they do not have an employer, they get excluded from the purview of labor laws because labor laws are basically based on employment relationship. And since they're excluded, they don't have any laws to regulate them or derive benefit from. So there are two situations when there are laws. Laws could not be applied to informal workers. and they're excluded from benefits, and the other situation when there are no laws for informal workers. So they get totally excluded from any legal or legislative protection. In order to protect informal workers, one of the first things that needs to be done is enact some legislation specifically addressed for these different kinds of informal workers. As I have mentioned, informal work is very heterogeneous in nature. There are different nature of worker, there are different kinds of worker working in agriculture, worker working in factories, worker self-employed, workers working in very small establishments. So all these different kinds of workers have their own different problems, their different priorities. Therefore, when we are enacting a law or legislation in order to provide benefits to these informal workers, these different categories of informal workers, what we need to do is we need to talk to these workers. We need to get into a conversation with these workers as to what are their requirements. We need to find out what these workers want, what they want to do with their lives. And therefore, dialogue with informal workers is an important criterion in order to formulate a law or a policy mechanism that could address problems of informal workers. So informal workers needs to be incorporated within a social dialogue framework that could give rise to a legislative mechanism which can protect their rights and benefits and interests. Importantly, the International Labour Organization, under the guidance of Juan Somavia, the Director General, came up with the idea of decent work. Now, decent work has 4 pillars: productive employment, rights at work, social protection, and social dialogue. So, my personal view is, with respect to informal workers, social dialogue is very important. However, the problem with the ILO establishment is ILO is based on bipartite or tripartite dialogue mechanism. So the government, employer, and the worker or their representatives enter into a dialogue. But the problem with informal workers are they do not have their trade union, they do not have a representative organization. So therefore, it's very difficult for them to enter into a dialogue within this tripartite or bipartite mechanism. What needs to be done is to innovate new mechanisms by which informal workers could be made part of the social dialogue framework that will discuss their problems, that will find out and identify what factors could improve their conditions, and then finally incorporate those factors or those conditions into laws with consultation with after consultation with informal workers. I think that could be an appropriate mechanism if we are thinking about improving the conditions of informal workers with the help of legislation or statutes.